If you accept everything said in the text of Germania without questioning a word of it, this is what we call a Tacitus approval. That was terrible. There are only a handful of windows that we have into the past when it comes to the nature of Germanic polytheism in general. Later on, we get Snorri's writings, the sagas, Saxo Grammaticus, the Poetic Edda, and Skaldic poetry, but all of these are preserved and written by Christians, which gives us a ton of information, but with the same bias in the form of this Christian lens. And for a vast period of time before that, we have almost zero evidence of what that religion looked like. And for heathens, this creates a frustrating challenge when it comes to understanding our faith and the context surrounding the stories we do have access to, which prompts the question, what windows do we have to peek into the past and find out what our religion looked like? There are more windows than you might think, and I can't cover them all in this video, but the view that they give of what ancient heathens might have believed will offer more questions than answers. But it does guide us to interesting questions, which I think is just incredibly cool. I'm going to be nerding out throughout this video because I love both history and comparative religion, so fair warning. This is what might be considered more advanced information, but it's also context that I think can give perspective on our religion. And I also figure that a lot of you are kind of used to me being just like a complete nerd by now. So the key here is to be comfortable with the fact that there are some things we're simply not going to know the answers to, and information is scarce. So, with that said, here we go. Oddly enough, one of the most hilarious yet completely valid windows that we have into the past on this matter is the current names for the days of the week, which sounds strange, but hear me out. The days of the week that we refer to in English are translations of the Roman days of the week, which were named for their gods. In this translation, we see taking place a thought process called Interpretatio Germanica, which is the interpretation of the Roman gods into the Germanic perspective by analogy. What seems to have happened is that the Germanic names for the days of the week relied on similarities between their gods and the Roman gods, so that they could honor their own deities in the names of the days of the week. By this mode of translation, we have a comparison point for where these deities may have stood in their pantheon, what associations they might have had, and we can discern these expectations by comparing them with myths written about these gods later on to sort of check our work. Now, the Romans named their days thusly: day of the sun, day of the moon, day of Mars, day of Mercury, day of Jupiter, day of Venus, and day of Saturn. And some of these days stayed the same, such as what we now call Sunday, Monday, and Saturday. However, 4 were translated into the Germanic perspective, which were Tuesday, which translates to the Norse Thursday, Woden's Day, or Odin's Day, Thunnar's Day, or Thor's Day, and Friel's Day, or Frigg's Day. Now we call these days Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Truly, I feel like I need to start pulling out Muppets for this episode or something like that. I just listed off the days of the week. Wednesday is Odin's Day. We're very serious here. On the basis of these translations, we can see that these deities share commonalities, such that it was seen appropriate to interchange them in the naming of these days. Tyr's connection with Mars would suggest that Tyr was seen to have a strong relationship with battle and war. Odin's connection with Mercury would suggest an association with trickery, thievery, travel, commerce, wisdom, and an interest and love of humanity. All of these things we seem to find consistent with Odin in the stories since. This analogy is continued by associating Thor with Jupiter, which is certainly an interesting translation. This would associate Thor with lightning and the sky, and a place of pride within the pantheon. And finally, we see an association with Frigg and Venus, suggesting that Frigg had a strong relationship with love and fertility. And this one specifically creates a challenge when it comes to checking our work because there's not very many stories of Frigg, and the information in later sources might suppose that Freya would be a better fit here, which may simply mean that the image that we have of Frigg is incomplete, And given the limited stories that we have about her, and the importance suggested in naming a day after her, this seems accurate. But these analogies are far from perfect, which is what we would expect because they're different gods. Certainly there are differences between Tyr and Mars, Thor and Jupiter, and so on. But this lends credence to the idea that our response as polytheists to this translation should not be one of seeing these deities as the same gods, showing themselves differently to different cultures, but as distinct deities. The differences between these deities are vast. However, we can learn a little about them through their similarities by seeing the effects of this process of translation. Further detailing this, we see the reverse translation taking place from the Roman perspective, just as Interpretatio Germanica is the Germanic interpretation of the Roman deities. We see Interpretatio Romana of foreign deities in a number of cases, including the Germanic deities, as noted by the important Roman historian Tacitus in his text Germania, which was written at the very end of the 1st century. So we're going back 1,000 years before the appearance of the first written Norse sources. Much of what we're going to discuss here comes from Tacitus, as he was the major Roman historian who discussed Germania beyond the Roman battles with the tribes there, providing a window, though biased from Roman eyes, into their way of life there. To give context, Germania was a constant source of stress for the northern border of Rome. Julius Caesar remarks in his record, The Gallic War, that they had become accustomed to crossing the Rhine in great numbers, and were a threat to the Roman people if unmitigated. One of his goals in the conquest of Gaul, which is modern-day France, was to ensure that the tribes of Germania stayed on their side of the Rhine River, either by fighting them directly or ensuring that the Gallic tribes bordering them could fight them for him. You might say that he drew a line in the sand. All right, I'm going to stop. This is serious heathenry here. In Germania, Tacitus notes that the people of Germania worship Mercury above all, as well as make sacrifice to Mars and Hercules. And he notes earlier on that it seems that Hercules had visited them, as their soldiers sing his praises on the way to battle. And he also mentions an imported worship of Isis by the Suebi of Germania. And the evidence that he gives for this importation is that the Isis worship is symbolized by a ship. Now again, we look at Tacitus's description as an analogy, not as if he's saying that those in Germania worship the Roman god Mercury, but that their high god seems to exhibit features of Mercury. Tacitus is using a shorthand to deliver information to the Romans. This would heavily suggest that the worship of Odin goes back to the 1st century at least. The mention of Mars and Hercules are also interesting and seem to reference some sort of 1st century images of Tyr and Thor. The text suggests that both Tyr and Thor have associations with battle, with Mars obviously being a war god, and the singing of praises to Hercules, or the Germanic Thor, before going into battle. Consider for a moment why these names are being used. If Tacitus had written Odin, which is unlikely that they would have called him Odin, but Odin, if he'd written that, and then given that to the Romans would have been like, what? Who's Odin? Tacitus is writing for a Roman audience, so his using the word Mercury here is the shorthand of delivering that message of understanding. Now, Tacitus mentions the Suebi, which Caesar referenced as the most powerful of the Germanic tribes, giving sacrifice to Isis. Now, Isis was worshipped by the Romans as well, syncretized into their religion. Her worship was spread wide throughout the empire, even showing up in Roman settlements in Britain, which explains why Tacitus would so readily mention her in his Interpretatio. However, Tacitus is likely not talking about Isis specifically, but some similar deity. Multiple candidates have been offered. Frigg, Freya, and Freyr have all been brought up as having similarities with the stories and associations surrounding Isis. And Frigg seems like the likely candidate, but the truth is that it's unclear who this deity is. And as unlikely as it is, Tacitus could have been talking about a localized worship of Isis herself. He also could have made it up. Isn't history fun? I'm just kidding, I'm crying. May the gods help me. To look at this a little bit deeper and add further mystery to the mention of Isis. Nearly 1,000 years later, Adam of Bremen writes about the Temple of Uppsala, And the deities that he describes there are Odin, Thor, and not Tyr, but Freyr, though in Sweden it would make sense that Freyr would fill this space that might elsewhere be filled by Tyr, as in Sweden, Freyr was central to kingly leadership and has a close relationship with the Swedish royalty. For more on that, I made a more in-depth video on Freyr, which you can see in the description and the iCard above. Isis, however, or any feminine deity that might fill a similar role, isn't mentioned at all. Another deity in which Tacitus goes into details about is Nerthus, a fertility deity whose idol is placed on a wagon and taken from town to town. Now, some of these practices seem to have later been inherited by Freyr, a dynamic that I discuss more in my video on Freyr, but her name is most closely associated with Njorthr, the father of Freyr, who bears very little similarity other than name, and it's hypothesized that Njorthr is her brother and consort, as it is mentioned in multiple sources, that Njorthr had a sister consort who is unnamed, and their worship seems to come from a similar location, but Nerthus, unfortunately, is not mentioned directly by name in any other source. Interestingly, looking at Caesar's Gallic War, Caesar talks about the religion of the Gauls, in which he mentions in his Interpretatio that the Gauls worship chiefly among their gods Mercury. He too mentions Mars and Jupiter in the same context, but also adds Apollo and finally Minerva, who bears similarities to the Greek deity Athena, a war goddess associated with wisdom. This might call to mind images of Freya, but given that we're talking about the Gauls and not Germania, and the fact that there is variation of religion across geography, it's hard to make direct conclusions. But this is something that reminds us that the Rhine River may not be the cultural dividing line that it's often assumed to be. The Rhine River seems to be more of an arbitrary marker in a gradient of cultures, more than anything else. It's important to note that in the Gallic War, Caesar writes extensively about the differences between those in Gaul and those in Germania, the Suebi specifically, showing that these are indeed very different peoples with very different cultures. So suggesting that they're the same would simply be inaccurate. But when it comes to Caesar's observations, there's a huge question about how accurate his descriptions of those differences might have been. This is, after all, a Roman writing about his enemies, people that he fought. And it's clear that he had some respect for them, but as a Roman, he still viewed them as barbarous tribes. So we need to consider that some of his observations about those in Germania may have been oversimplifications. Going back to Germania, Tacitus goes on to mention a uniform process of divination by carving symbols into sliced twigs and casting lots onto a white cloth, suggesting a possible usage of runes for divination. The process he describes involves a form of divination that contains both positive and negative interpretation and requires multiple casting of lots for a reading. Prayer, even in the privacy of households, is discussed, suggesting that this was a common practice as well. He also mentions the reading of signs through animals around them. Specifically, he mentions birds, bringing to mind Odin's ravens and Freya's association with birds of prey. The gifting cycle is also mentioned in Germania, in which Tacitus relates it to the religion, saying that it was seen as impious to turn away strangers. Now, it's possible that Tacitus's description of the gifting cycle here is corrupted because he seems to be making fun of it and describes it as a system that is commonly exploited, but he ends it with observing that they take delight in presents, but ask no credit for them and admit no obligation in receiving them. Relating this gifting cycle to reciprocity with deity is a short step. It follows that they would see a tradition of giving and receiving gifts with the gods as part of their image of religion. Tacitus also mentions something very interesting, which is that the tribes of Germania do not deem it consistent with the divine majesty to imprison their gods within walls or represent them with human forms. And he continues by saying that they consecrate woods and groves, and they call by the names of the gods the hidden presence that they see only by the eye of reverence. Caesar says something similar about the Suebi, suggesting that they only worship what they can see, but this seems to conflict with Tacitus's analysis and feeds into that oversimplification that we mentioned earlier. Now, because the Greeks and Romans built grand temples to their deities, they took notice when others did not do this. The sparse evidence of temples during this time suggests that Tacitus might be making an accurate observation here as far as to whether or not they built temples. However, what isn't quite verifiable is the justification he assigns to why this is. Tacitus's explanation would suggest that it's somehow impious to build an altar or a temple, which doesn't seem to be the case. We see, for example, that the Norse build temples to the gods later on, both through archaeology and their descriptions by historians such as Adam of Bremen, mentioned earlier, and the writers of the sagas. So the justification, if true, is not something that endured. But even with the existence of temples, we do see the continuation of the tradition of sacred woods and groves in the names of the gods across the heathen world. The useful observation here is that there isn't a requirement for a temple in order to practice or give offering. Beyond that, the lack of information means that there's significant room for discussion at the very least. This leads us briefly to place names, as these groves and forests sacred to the gods would often be named for them. Towns would often be named after a temple there or a forest nearby, so we can get a quick understanding of where these deities were worshipped by noting the names of towns and forests around the heathen world. This is why so many places in Sweden are named after Freyr, as he was central to the worship there. Finally, Tacitus discusses in Germania that ancient hymns were the source of their record-keeping, suggesting an oral tradition that dated back generations to preserve their stories, and that this preservation was done through ways of memorizing through poetic rhythm. Some of that rhythm can be detected in later poetry that is eventually recorded by Norse writers, and this suggests that these stories, in their originating tradition, are meant to be sung, which isn't uncommon. The most notable modern example of this would be the Quran, which can also be sung, and is often memorized this way. Now, this isn't certain, but it would suggest that these stories were often shared in a musical way. And this would make sense because speaking in verse is fairly common in the sagas. The cryptic sailor songs I've mentioned in another video about Ran, the sea goddess of death, comes to mind. And this would probably translate well into group rituals and festivals, which may have had a musical component to share the stories of the gods. So you can imagine incredible rituals in which the legends were sung by those leading ritual in order to pass on their stories and familiarize everyone with these songs. This gives a whole new view about what we've lost over the course of time, and brings to mind the image of what we have in the Poetic Edda as being this strange Christian remix album of past mythical hits. Something to keep in mind is that there wasn't anything like a canonical text to keep this religion rigid across time. The stories that we have are the result of a religion that in history was very localized. There were variations across time and place, which means that even if we had all the answers to the questions that we have about an ancient practice of this faith, it would likely represent only one of several variations that existed. The way that Freyr was worshipped in Sweden was likely very different than how he was worshipped in Iceland, hence the variation in place names. And it's a mystery as to whether or not Skadi or Heimdall were ever worshipped by the Suebi of Germania. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed my just absolute nerding out. I hope you get what I mean by the evidence that we have only leading to more questions rather than answers. It's a frustrating dynamic that can only be exciting if you're the kind of person who just loves impossible puzzles, but much like the philosophy relating to the gods and the multitude of variation that we find there regarding an inaccessible truth, so too is history a discussion of varied ideas about the past with an inaccessible truth. All we get are a series of vague hints. And honestly, I find that fascinating. And with that, hail to my patrons for making this content possible. It's good to have people at your back. Be sure to like, subscribe, and ring that damn bell. And finally, remember to rate this video 5 stars, which is, from an originalist perspective, the correct way to like a YouTube video. And remember to find a way or make one.